Welcome to Rooted by Grace. In this episode, I will share a story of a very awkward dinner Apostle Paul had and how he remained level-headed in the midst of the storm. So let me set the scene for you. Apostle Paul gets arrested in Jerusalem for his preaching, and as a Roman citizen, he appeals to Caesar. This means he wants to go to the highest court, which is located in Rome. As a result, he travels as a prisoner from Jerusalem to Rome, encountering different types of obstacles. Paul, being Paul, looks at the bright side of life, and he sees his prison sentence as the perfect opportunity to share the gospel with everyone. At one point, he is assigned to a ship to Italy, and this is recorded in Acts chapter 27. Now, when I hear of a ship sailing to Italy, I'm like, sign me up. I imagine this gorgeous cruise going to Italy. Well, not for Paul. Paul did not travel in style. He had a very awful experience, quite deadly, actually. So Paul is probably in an extremely uncomfortable situation. Plus, he is bound by shackles on this ship. The ship has 276 people on board, most of them prisoners. After a few days of sailing, the ship needs to stop at a harbor because of the high winds it's encountering. And they stop for a period of time as they're waiting for the weather to calm down. And also the crew is discussing and making plans to start the journey to Rome again. Paul, being reasonable, looks at the situation, assesses it, and gives advice not to sail. And we can read this in verse 9 and 10. But now much time had passed. The voyage was already dangerous since the fast was already over. Paul gave his advice and told them, "Men, I can see that this voyage is headed towards damage and heavy loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our lives." But the centurion paid attention to the captain and the owner of the ship rather than to what Paul said. I can just imagine Paul's frustration. We see Paul as a scholar that wrote most of the New Testament, but in this particular situation, Paul was a prisoner and he was seen as a prisoner. The word of the centurion went, and the centurion decided to obey the captain of the ship. So all the prisoners were rounded up and they were boarded back on ship towards Rome. And soon into their journey, guess what happens? A terrible storm. They encounter a storm, and this storm is so crazy that they don't see the sun or the stars for a few days. Can you imagine being tossed back and forth by strong winds and not even seeing daylight? The storm is so intense that everybody on board loses hope of being saved. Well, everyone except Paul. I want to read the following account directly from Acts chapter 27, starting at verse 20. The terrible storm raged for many days, blotting out the sun and the stars, until at last all hope was gone. No one had eaten for a long time. Paul finally called the crew together and said, "Men, you should have listened to me in the first place and not left Crete. You would have avoided all of this damage and loss. But take courage. None of you will lose your lives, even though the ship will go down. For last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me. And he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar. What's more, God, in his goodness, has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. So take courage, for I believe God. It will be just as he said. but we will be shipwrecked on an island. You would think that having heard Paul say that an angel of God came to him, everyone on the ship would take courage and believe and everything would be all right. Well, that didn't happen. The sailors did not believe Paul. They actually sought to escape the ship. They feared the ship would hit rock, shatter into pieces, and their lives would be lost. In verse 30, it says, "Then the sailors tried to abandon the ship. They lowered the lifeboat as though they were going to put anchors from the front of the ship. But Paul said to the commanding officer and the soldiers, 'You will all die unless the sailors stay aboard.' So the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboat and let it drift away." This situation does not look good. The sailors are probably upset with Paul for snitching on them. Everyone on board is weak, seasick, without hope, no motivation. But Paul has faith in God. Paul again gets inspired to say something, but this time offers some practical support to his crewmates. And we can read this in verse 33. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." And when he said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they all were encouraged and ate some food themselves. Phew, that must have been the stormiest dinner ever recorded. The story doesn't end there. After they eat and regain their strength, the ship shipwrecks. And to make things worse, verse 42 says, the soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners to make sure they didn't swim ashore and escape. Yikes. If I were a fellow prisoner with Paul, I would be asking Paul some questions. Like, didn't your God say everything would be okay? For a moment there, you got me. I felt God's presence when you prayed. I regained my strength when I ate that food. But now, look at where we are. The ship is in pieces. We're in the middle of a terrible storm, and this shoreline is rocky and dangerous. Oh, Paul, I'm just done. I'm done with your motivational and encouraging speeches, and I don't know what kind of God you serve. I wonder what Paul would have told me. I'm not sure. Maybe that's why I'm not a prisoner next to Paul. But everyone does miraculously make it to shore. Some swim, others hold on to planks or debris that were broken from the ship. And God's word remains to be true. Man, what an experience. They land on an island called Malta, and Paul shares some stories worth reading. I encourage you to read chapter 28, so that's Acts chapter 28, to see what happens on the island of Malta. Right now, I want to take a moment to reflect on this experience and see what we can learn from it. There are two specific things I want to point out. One, Paul remains level-headed in the midst of chaos. My question is, how? How can someone remain level-headed in the midst of chaos? Things weren't going well for Paul. Paul remains level-headed by having faith in God. We see in verse 25, Paul says, "Take heart, men, for I have faith in God." Paul has faith in God and he hears directly from God. But that doesn't mean Paul avoids the storm. Although everything around him goes against him, he doesn't lose hope. He remains grounded and level-headed by having faith in God. And another thing I want to point out, Paul helps the people around him. Paul doesn't keep silent. He shares the revelation from God that he has with his crewmates to encourage them. And also, he doesn't hog all of the food. I want to mention something. Not everyone believed Paul. Paul's advice of not starting the journey in the first place was ignored. Paul shared that an angel of God stood before him, and still some ignored him. Although he was ignored, Paul encouraged everyone to eat and gave them bread. Once they took from the food themselves, they got strengthened and encouraged. I want to encourage you. If you are in the midst of chaos, if there is a storm in your life, keep seeking God. Put your faith in Him, not in your circumstance or in other people. And if you have the possibility to practically help someone that is in the storm with you, do so. Your practical support mixed with the words of encouragement will pay off. If Paul didn't distribute dinner to his shipmates, someone might have perished. They probably wouldn't have had enough strength to swim to shore. As a side note, in the YouTube description of this video, I have linked an interesting CBN video of them finding possible remains of the shipwreck Paul encountered. Check it out. Main takeaway. My main takeaway is make sure your encouraging words are intertwined with practical support. I want to hear your main takeaway from Acts chapter 27. If you're watching this on YouTube, please comment below. If you're listening by podcast, please leave a comment through the platform you are using. Till next time, stay rooted.